Broadcasting live from Camp Bloodbath, this is the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, a film club where we dissect the eerie intersections of gender and horror. My name is Louisa, and I'm joined by my final girls,
Mila,
Tyia,
and Zeba.
And this is our next episode on our horror parody theme. We will be covering the 2015 comedy slasher, The Final Girls, directed by Todd Strauss-Schulson. Before we get into the film, go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcasts app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast.
3 years after the untimely death of her mother, Nancy, high schooler Max is convinced to attend an honorary screening of her most notable work, an 80s cult horror classic film called Camp Bloodbath. However, during this double feature, the theater is suddenly set ablaze. Max and her friends narrowly escape the deadly fire by pulling back the theater curtain only to find that they have now entered the movie itself. Max reels at the sight of the on-screen reincarnation of her mother, shy girl Amanda, who is scripted to die after having sex with the movie's jock archetype. The real-life characters realize that in order to survive themselves, they must help the fictional characters defy typical slasher film tropes and vanquish the movie's killers.
I love you. This is why I never got to tell her.
Don't worry. Wherever she is, she knows. You're right about one thing, you know.
What?
I'm a movie star.
If we're talking all about a film called The Final Girls, then I want to know everyone's favorite final girl, or at least maybe one whose praises aren't sung as much as the usual suspects.
I know yours, Tyia. Is it not Midsummer? Does she count?
Yeah, she counts. I would agree. That's true.
Sorry to answer for you. I was going to say Red from Us, especially with the twist. She's real final girl behavior to me.
Maybe Ripley, just because I'm such an alien stan. And I love her kind of embodying what was deemed cold feminism at the time.
I agree with Red. I think that's a really nice choice. But I also think, and I've realized I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but Coralie, is it Farge? I'm so sorry. The Substances director, her debut Revenge, a classic rape revenge final girl, is quite rewarding to watch, definitely. But depending on how much you like to endure intense violence.
Although I will say her survival in that movie when she first survives the attack was absolutely
Superhuman? Yeah.
Girl, I don't know how.
She earned that final girl status.
I know we've talked about this, we said in one of the episodes, God knows which one, what would our horror movie archetypes be? And I think we deemed Tyia as our final girl. I remember the conversation only because y'all deemed me the slut who would die. And then
Absolutely wild from us, actually.
And needs no revision.
I feel like this is so not true of all of us.
Just given the options available, you know?
I just feel like that's unfair because there are people in this group who...
I was about to say, the way you said of all of us makes it sound like you got somebody in mind.
Yeah, and I'm looking at two of them. At least, I don't know. Maybe Ty is more discreet with her hoeing, but you two.
This was for the whatchamacallit episode. Oh, Cabin in the Woods, which is also horror parody. I think that's when we had this conversation.
Good memory. Jesus Christ. I would have never gotten that.
It's because everybody made me the stoner.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, okay. Fine. I can be the slut because I do want you to stay the stoner, but I still don't know what Mila's is then.
I would not believe in the superstition. I wouldn't believe in the law. I would go investigate and die.
Fine. I wanted to give us a chance to revise it.
No.
But...
The Monstrous Feminine is on YouTube, so please go subscribe and leave us a comment on one of our videos. If you do engage with our content, you might just get a shout out in our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode, our Witch of the Week is Emily, who commented on our Wicker Man episode and said, "Yo, I love finding a good podcast with a backlog." So true, bestie. We do have a backlog. I also love a podcast with a backlog, and everybody should go back and re-listen to episodes. It's quite the archive.
Going on 5th year, so there's a lot of content. And if you become a Patreon pledge, if you're May Queen, then you can see our bonus content where we had some bonus episodes that we released that have not been published to the rest of the world. So you should go listen there. Or if you subscribe to our Substack, you can find bonus content there too. The world's your oyster.
You can find all of our links and our information on our social media. Please support us. Any contribution helps.
Who do you guys think is this particular movie's most effective final girl? Is it Paula, the scripted original? Is it Amanda or Nancy, the kind of desired final girl? Or is it Max, the actual final girl? Who is your personal fave?
I'd say Max out of solidarity with American Horror Story Season 1.
I'll go with her as well. I also really liked her in Coven as well.
I am a fan of Tyia Farmiga. I feel like she's part of my queer awakening. The first American Horror Story, when that came out, I can't remember what year it was, but I remember really being quite attached to her. Whenever I was attached to random actresses in media, it was usually because I had a little crush on them. So I think that I also have to go Max for that, for to pay homage to the queer youth that was me.
Well, I don't want to be like everybody else. Can I say Max's mom?
That is a strong second. I think that's a heartwarming development.
Yeah, actually, Sebastian Zavala-Khan for Screen Anarchy in a review spoke about how this movie, I'll read, actually has a heart, telling an unexpectedly touching story about the relationship between a girl and her late mother and a said girl's hopes of a reunion, at least with the fake movie mom. Her motivations when she meets Nancy are clear. She wants her to survive and come back to the world with her. It's something anyone can get behind, and it helps develop Max as a sad, very emotional, and real character, as opposed to a walking stereotype. I think, actually, just this film does do characterization fairly well, which we have commented on the podcast before is sometimes a challenge in the horror genre, where you have a limited amount of time before you have to start axing people off. But I think this is quite an effective backstory or bond that's being depicted here. So yeah, I guess the mum is a strong second for a favorite final girl.
I didn't watch this when it came out. I didn't know about it, but I watched it more recently, and I think this would have been super effective watching it in 2015 in terms of it as a parody. I think watching it now, it's just already outdated. Things become so past the use by date. I just a lot faster, I found. But I think that you're right. The emotional heart of the film is something that still does hold up. A lot of that is to do with our final girl. I think she has a really great puppy dog look that I think is what kind of endears people to her. But yeah, I kind of wish I'd seen this. I mean, 2015, that didn't even seem long ago, and I'm like, oh my god, I was 19. Okay.
Do you feel like it was a fresh interpretation of parody of the horror tropes on top of A Cabin in the Woods and a Scream and a Scary Movie, just another one?
Yeah, just entertaining.
After seeing this movie again, I thought this is quite entertaining. And then it made me reflect on something that's going to be a very surprising thing, which is maybe the Black Christmas remake wasn't as bad as I thought it was.
Because I'll never ever
I'll never get behind that.
What made you think that, Tyia, related to this movie?
Because it was recommended, and so I saw it again, and I was like, there's some parts of this that aren't terrible. It's just the execution of it all is not great. But the movie itself isn't awful. I think, as Zeba mentioned previously on the last episode, grief horror is sort of its own animal. And I feel like people now feel like every horror film character needs some grief to ground it and to make character development. And so they will throw in their mom is dead in the first 5 minutes, like a Disney movie. And then you're like, that's a lot to digest. And then they have a couple scenes where they're like, I just really miss her. That's a core theme to everything. And they have to make them have some sort of personal tragedy or grief. And this film was another one where that happened. And I was like, I'm really starting to see formulas. Every single one. I don't know, y'all. Maybe we need to do something else.
However, I think that element was fresh at the time. Inserting grief into a slasher, into a sexy slasher.
Mate, we just said in Scream her mom was also dead in that one. Like, this has been a reoccurring thing that has happened over time.
But that wasn't the center of it.
I mean, it's a pretty big plot point for her, and that's why she can't have sex with him in the film, is because she's like traumatized at the fact that her mom was raped and murdered, coincidentally by her actual boyfriend. Part of it is like films that are centered in grief get better reviews, and so people tend to add that in there because they are seen like more elevated.
I don't think this film was received as elevated.
This wasn't received as elevated, but it actually has pretty good reviews for a horror film.
Because I think it was seen as like an interesting spin on the genre because it like had an emotional weight to it. That's what seemed fresh to people.
But even when we go back to, what is that movie called? The Descent. Even in that one, like her husband and her baby are dead, and so she has like the personal trauma. Like, this has been a reoccurring theme. I think horror films that are overwhelmingly seen as good have some sort of like, the character is characterized by some sort of personal grief or trauma. And so people keep replicating that in films, but now it's getting to the point where like, you're like, oh, another one. And so watching this now, it felt like less of a novelty to me than when I saw it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, actually. It's almost like a new final girl trope, isn't it? That you like have to have like a traumatic backstory.
But I don't think that's true in slashers. Those like superficial, sexy tits out slashers.
Even in Hush on Netflix, where the girl is like, she's deaf. Even in that one, like, she suffered a personal tragedy. She's going through a breakup. She's like depressed. And so that's why she's like retreated into the woods. Like,
Okay, I think characters can have things happen to them. Like a breakup is quite ordinary.
It's like an easy off-camera way to like say that this character has depth without having to like do it in the script. Like if something happened to them before the movie started, then it's like, trust us, this is not the shallow regular final girl.
Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is a slasher, but still we have, she just got out of rehab and all of her friends cut her off while she was when she was addicted to drugs.
These are just normal characterizations, like, surely. Like, I think grief I'm agreeing with you on. But I think just people having like anything like negative happen to them is not necessarily always just as an insert. I mean, it technically is. That's what fucking fiction is. Like, they're trying to like flesh out these characters. And horror isn't by nature the happiest genre.
It's not the happiest genre. Yeah, I mean, I was actually sort of going to do something like this for my dissertation. That's not what I landed on eventually, but I read an entire article of someone saying, like, after dealing with a lot of grief, they started watching a lot of horror films because they found that fear and sadness are like so closely related that it's almost soothing to watch horror films when you are going through a fit of sadness and grief, because it sort of gives it some meaning, and a lot of the characters are going through similar situations, especially because like in horror films, I think grief is sort of accelerated. Like when you're in a slasher, it'll be like their husband gets killed and 5 seconds later they gotta run and figure out how to get out the house, and they don't have like the time to really process things. And so then at the end you'll have like this flood of grief that comes on sort of at the end. And in this one, I think it's a bit different because she sort of goes back and she's experiencing being with a pseudo version of her mother. But I don't know. Watching this now, it felt like less of a novelty. And I had to keep reminding myself, but this came out years ago, because it doesn't feel outdated. So it's sort of like, if you see it now, or if this came out now, it would definitely not get the same reviews. I think people would just sort of be like, But at the time it came out, I think it was more of a novelty.
I think how it approaches grief is, like you said, like that she's meeting a younger version of her mother within the logics of a horror film in which only a certain person can survive. I think that is a really still fresh idea. I don't think the parody aspect has longevity, just because like that 2010s humor, man, was fucked. Like, it was just so bad. But I don't know, I really think that grief element in this film isn't necessarily within the repeated tropes we see. Using grief as like a write-off for something with depth.
I kind of agree with both of you in the sense that like I think this is a creative way of doing it in this film, like what Mila just said. I think that not necessarily in a slasher, because The Descent or whatever is not a slasher, but in horror more broadly, I think there is a final girl trope of like they're grieving, or like grieving either the loss of a person or like a really traumatic event. So I do think that it is more broadly, but I do also see that it's not as prevalent in maybe a slasher specifically. don't know. I'm trying to remember Friday the 13th. I mean, Friday the 13th actually, because like the mom is the killer and she's grieving Jason. Oh wait, but she's not the final girl. Sorry, excuse me. I actually can't remember who the final girl is or who the final character is in Friday the 13th. I'm so sorry. I wasn't a huge fan of that film.
Maybe we owe M. Night Shyamalan his flowers for the movie Split, because when he says like she can survive in the movie because she's really suffered, he's like, because you know true suffering, you get to live. I'm like, that's basically now the entire trope. It's like if you have suffered some sort of loss, you get to live to the end of the movie.
Alice Hardy was the final girl, but I can't remember anything about Alice Hardy. And I can't remember Jamie Lee Curtis, like her character in Halloween, if she had a bad backstory. I can't remember. Although, hang on, let's go to the final girl like trope. Let's move along. So, as I think everybody knows, Carol Clover in first an essay called Her Body Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film, but then later elaborated on in Carol Clover's full book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, which was published in 1992. She examines slashers from the 1970s and 80s and like notes down some prominent films which have a final girl survivor, like Psycho, Voice of the Desire, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Alien, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, Terrifier 2, etc. I should also preface that this summary is coming from Wikipedia because it was actually quite a good summary. Essentially, the characterization of Final Girl is that she's a sole survivor. She has many common characteristics, such as she's usually sexually unavailable or virginal. She usually avoids the vices like illegal drug use or alcohol. She sometimes has a unisex name. Sometimes she has a shared history with the killer. So maybe that's where we're getting the kind of trauma element. Like there's some sort of symmetry or there. The main argument of the book, and I'm reading again from the Wikipedia, Clover suggested that in these films, the viewer began by sharing the perspective of the killer, but experienced a shift in identification to the final girl partway through the film. One of the basic premises of Clover's theory is that the audience identification is unstable and fluid across gender lines, particularly in the case of the slasher film. Clover argues that the final girl becomes masculinized through phallic appropriation because she takes up a weapon like a knife or a chainsaw against the killer. The phenomenon of the male audience having to identify with a young female character in an ostensibly male-orientated genre, usually associated with sadistic voyeurism, raises interesting questions about the nature of the slasher film and their relationship with feminism. So yeah, I mean, that's the kind of summary of the theory.
In this film, I feel like it doesn't surprise me. Like, it doesn't play with the trope enough for it to have called itself Final Girls. Like, that just feels like a thing to call it for SEO reasons. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think they didn't take the opportunity as a satire, doing a satire, to like go through all of those things that you listed and like play with them and like do something interesting with them and our expectations. So I was a little disappointed on that front. Not in our final girl, but like in the writing, not taking every opportunity in the way that other parodies have done so well, especially on the like virginal, masculine ones that are very typical. Like, I guess they've been done to death a little bit, but I wish they had done more here.
I agree. I think they only focused on the virginal aspect of it, and that's kind of boring because like Scream does it. Like all these different parodies have already commented on that fact, so I kind of agreed that I wanted them to play with almost like the gender expectations of it, which is the kind of really interesting thing in the Clover essay. It doesn't feel like they engaged as much as they could have with the text, with the source material, but it's still like a fun like film in and of itself, but I agree that it feels like SEO titled. I love that depiction, horror film.
I do think Cabin in the Woods is like kind of the pinnacle for referencing and commenting on and pulling humor out of all of the tropes, including the final girl. It's difficult to do. Horror is already so self-referential and can be so campy that the tone that's normally used in parody is already kind of at home in horror, like slashers. Yeah, you kind of need to be determined with if you want to make any sort of points, because otherwise it just reads as the same, if you know what I mean. The fact that we aren't sure who the final girl is it the one that's written? Is it the one that is wanted, the one that it ends up being. Like, that could have been kind of commented on a bit more.
Yeah, I guess they give Max the like unisex name, and then Max is actually the final girl. But I feel like that's the only real, that and the virgin thing are like played up, and I'm just kind of like, oh, come on, do more.
And even if that's the point, and that they're like redirecting this final girl trope, the characterizations that make up a final girl, it's presented to us like, this is the final girl, who, I guess, I can't remember her name, but
Paula.
Paula isn't necessarily, I'd say, characterized enough so that we're like, yes, that's definitely recognizably the final girl.
Yeah, they killed her too quick, didn't they?
They killed her too quick. They really did, yeah. I know that was supposed to be the funny thing, but like, yeah.
I feel like she needed to come in with like a pixie cut, lesbian coded bitch, but like she wasn't really that. She was just like super hot. And then like, in the context of the film, like, and you had that like jock stupid character being like, oh, she's so, and like just making jokes about how he wanted to like basically have sex with everyone. But like, I feel like that was like her only thing. And I'm like, oh, well, we could have had a really cool explanation of like what, almost like a conversation with like the final girl of the 80s versus the final girl of today. But I don't feel like that opportunity was taken, and instead used that kind of time to do the grief element, or like the kind of mother-daughter relationship, which I'm not mad about, because I do think that we've said here that gives it the kind of, maybe, well, you said, Mila, originality of it, but I do think, yeah, it doesn't quite warrant its name. I feel like there could be a better film. We should write it.
If anything, it's like a grief film that's been inserted into a horror film. Like, it doesn't seem to actually like be that versed on the text, and I'm talking like capital T text of horror. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's very surface level. I know that, I don't know, maybe it always reads surface level because it's kind of like a slasher, but I don't know, I just think it could have engaged a bit better with it.
It's kind of wild to me that Max's mom made the original movie, because I was like, this is not what I would expect her mom to have made. It doesn't really feel like it fits with horror canon, especially even for like an 80s film. I feel like the final girl in 80s films were not like the hot girl who everyone wanted. Even like Jamie Lee Curtis as a final girl, she did have like a pixie cut, and we've been over this in quite a few movies where we said the characters were, I guess, like the more meek.
Yeah, they're prudish. Like, that's the point.
Yeah, I don't know. I felt like her final girl in this movie was kind of a strange choice, but also like it just didn't seem like it would have been that interesting to watch as a film.
People love those like campy, stupid films.
It was like as if Scary Movie parodied a horror film, but then they added the grief element, and that's what saved it.
I don't think we were supposed to have been engaged with the actual like Camp Bloodbath though, because that's like supposed to be that silly derivative slasher. Camp Bloodbath is a great name.
I was gonna say, I disagree with you, Tyia. I actually was thinking, I want to see Camp Bloodbath. This film I want to get high, Zeba, and I want to with you and watch Camp Bloodbath.
Do y'all watch Bob's Burgers? On Bob's Burgers, they have all these like fake cult horror movies that they're always referencing. Like, Bob is into these like, big screenings of horror, like niche horror movies that only he and like, like a weird fandom know about. He's always trying to like introduce Tina to like his campy horror movies from his past. Like, this felt like one of those where like everybody knows every line and they like go to see it every year and they dress up. It was just like a stand-in for one of those, I suppose. But like, it is true that like, how often do the actors from those ever make it as a real actor in anything else? Like, the stigma, I feel like, follows you.
Yeah, now I'm trying to think of final girl actresses.
Besides Jamie Lee Curtis, of course.
I was gonna say Jamie Lee Curtis obviously did, and then Sigourney Weaver. I don't even think, who are the other ones?
I'm trying to think of one that's like a bad movie, like one that's so good, like so bad it's good. Like, those actors never really make it out. Jennifer Tilly, she's not a final girl, but she cannot escape the Chuckyverse either. She's on the TV show.
Moving away from the actual movie and going back to just the trope on its own.
I like to think we're a little less puritanical nowadays, that the trope hasn't, it just doesn't land the same way. Like, we don't think people are like deserve to die for fucking, for the most part, I think, even subconsciously.
Well, I guess it depends on what state you live in.
In New York, they aren't excited for you to die.
The biggest part of this movie is essentially the fact that she's sort of having a pseudo reunion with her mom and not anything about changing the trope or really changing who's the final girl. That's sort of just like a consequence of everything else that happens.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely reads like an afterthought. In terms of the trope itself, there's been like a lot of like responses to Clover. I feel like the most boring critique of the final girl is when like the flurry of people who like pointed out like, but this film doesn't fit the pattern and this film doesn't fit the pattern. I feel like Clover did like enough evidence and like analysis of the canon to like point out a theme and like talk about why, and it was really useful for everyone to like kind of identify why do we have these kind of tropes in women that we deem can survive and whatnot and worthy of living, I guess, in a film. There's a really interesting theorist or critic or writer, Jack Halberstam, who wrote Skin Show's Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters back in 1995, actually. And they have a really good critique of this kind of Carol Clover's work, and they say Clover is less clear about the potential identification that horror allows between female viewers and the male or female aggressor. She also has a tendency to restabilize gendered positions in relation to horror. The queer tendency of horror, in my opinion, lies in its ability to reconfigure gender, not simply through the inversion by quite literally creating new categories. So I really like Jack Halberstam's engagement with Clover, because I think that while it was really interesting that Clover encouraged us to think about who horror is made for, and she deemed it men, and that's like kind of her where she situates it, and then she talks about why it would matter that women survive it, and I think that is true. Like a lot of these slashers in particular were made for a male audience, and horror tends to be marketed towards a male audience, even if that's not necessarily its mark. Like that was the whole reason we talked about Jennifer's Body failing in its first livery, because it was marketed towards men, but it's a movie that actually it was women and like marginalized people who like queer community, I guess, resonate, and it became a cult classic in that way. But I also agree with Halberstam's critique of like the idea that Clover's analysis is kind of a little bit like situated in like a gender binary, even as she's talking about the fluidity of it. And I think now, I mean, Halberstam was saying this back in 1995, but still, I think even more so now, we have a language to talk about kind of gender fluidity in film, and the way that, and we talk about all the time on the podcast, the way that horror deliberately bends categories and becomes a little bit uncategorizable with its characters, which is why you have the kind of fluidity between like stereotypical gender expectations and stuff. And yeah, and I kind of agree with Halberstam's assessment that like horror is refusing categorizations a lot of the time rather than resisting this urge to restabilize it. That's my kind of perception of like the final girl as like an academic theory then and now.
I think I'd have to really disagree that I think the final girl is a trope that allows for like that fluidity. Final girls often being masculinized. Yes, like audiences might like find some sort of like resonate with it, and it helps them identify with a character if it seems like a woman is being allowed some kind of like complexity in how they express their gender. I don't think it's like necessarily what's like the final result of it is like more that this sort of empty vessel of woman is given like pure innocence. Also, their sort of ability to go the distance is like obviously dependent on not having sex, being pretty head smart, but also I think this like boyishness is part of what kind of adds to that like sense of depth and intelligence and street smarts. I don't think it's like blurring gender expectations so much. Maybe that is what like a queer audience might take from it. It's also really cathartic to see them battle such violence and like come out, and survive until the end. Like I think that's why so many women and gay people love horror. But I don't know if I agree that the final girl trope really lends itself to horror's ability to blend these categories and sort of like reject binaries. I think that's more so like something that we see, I don't know, with sort of like monstrous characters or like splicing human beings with non-human forms.
I think I should clarify that this was part of a text that then went on to talk about the skin. It's quite an abstract essay, but it's like the skin as a kind of boundary. And the essay is called Bodies That Splatter within it. And it's parodying, like, it's obviously riffing off of Judith Butler's text. But yeah, and it's talking about the skin as a technology, and then when that's violated, and like the very fact of like gore and horror and like breaking skin, and like that creating like different forms of human, even through monstrosity, and then that creates another category of gender. And they were talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre specifically. I guess reading that in the context of the whole article kind of makes sense. But again, that's a little bit more of, I think it's just a bit more abstract of like a point.
I think that is an interesting like way to go about it and see the ways in which gore and violence against bodies can create some sort of strange blurring when we're all just cut up and we're all just meat, which I totally agree with. I think just as the final girl is this sort of like, I don't think it offers us as much of that sort of more interesting, almost radical like blurring of categories that I think horror can. I think the final girl seems like the most conservative one to me. But yeah, I like that. I like that idea, definitely.
I think it was in relation to like the final girl in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and specifically when, because like obviously she has to get blooded in order to kill. It's like when they have to kill the killer, they're participating in that gore.
I think it's like a chicken or the egg situation. Like these characters in the original movies were made by men, and I almost wonder if like subconsciously they believe that like only this particular type of woman could kill the killer, somebody who's smarter than the average woman in their mind, or like not so stupid as to have sex with men, because I think they secretly think that that is like a dumb decision that women make, and like that's like what, like why they deserve to be killed, because like they know whatever goes on in a man's mind is probably worse than we think it is. So they're like, what kind of idiot would voluntarily have sex with a man?
I hear y'all.
They might be onto something. They really might be onto something. Or is it that like these are actually in some instances cool and empowering characters that we can like reclaim despite the fact that they are perhaps made with seedy intentions? Like I think at the point of we're discussing parody, like we are almost beyond the conversation of like, is this intentional? Is this not intentional? We also discussed this with Cabin in the Woods of like, it does the thing that it's critiquing in a few instances. And I think that's true of Scream. I think that's true of like most of these parody movies. Like it's not even that things slip through the cracks. It's like, it's almost a mask off moment of like, no, but you think that this is actually funny. Like, it's not that you think it's like wrong that this trope is the way that it is. Like you do think it's funny, like it genuinely, and not in a like, haha, we're all in on the joke, like misogyny is bad kind of way. It's like sometimes I think men do find misogyny funny, not because it's wrong, but funny because it's funny to them. So I think that like the lines get blurred in satire. And of the final girl trope in particular. Like, yeah, why is she hot here? It just feels like a complete, like, misread of, like, the trope that they've chosen to center this particular movie around. But in answer to your question about, like, is this something that queer and marginalized people are able to overlook and reclaim? Or is it, like, I don't know. I think it's fine. I think it's perfectly reasonable. Like, some final girls are great to project on, and some final girls are, like, exploitative, and I actually don't think they're as similar as we make them out to be.
That's true. I feel like there is this like perception of like the final girl as like super aspirational, to say the least, that you want to survive. Like you're looking up to her because she survived, but also like just in general of like the traits. Like in this film, the kind of film nerd character says, "Ever since I was a little boy, I dreamed of being the final girl." Also, if we go back to Scream, actually, so Kevin Williamson, who wrote Scream, said that the final girl is basically like quite an icon, particularly for like gays. I'm presuming that he also means like specifically male gays. He said in an interview with Adam White for The Independent, "As a gay kid, I related to the final girl and to her struggle because it's what one has to do to survive as a young gay kid too. You're watching this girl survive the night and survive the trauma she's enduring. Subconsciously, I think the Scream movies are coded in gay survival." And then he talked about how, like, in later franchise sequels, he cast women who are beloved by gay men, like Laurie Metcalf, Parker Posey, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Carrie Fisher. Or sorry, the writer Adam White notes that the later casting feeds into, like, queer icons. Also in the interview with Pride Source about how gay kids everywhere understand that survival element and that we have to create it in ourselves. And when we're watching that final girl have to prove herself and rise to the challenge to save her life, I think that's something gay kids anywhere can relate to. In the context of Scream, not this movie, but there is this sort of like, this movie talks about, like, kind of hints that it's like aspirational for people.
But that's what I like that this movie does, is that although it doesn't like set any foundation for the final girl, well, it sets some. What I mean is any that we deemed adequate. It doesn't really set like enough foundation for the final girl, but I like that it redirects the sort of purpose of it as not so much rewriting the final girl to speak to those tropes, but it is as a way to like deal with grief, and the finality of death is kind of like, you know, shifted onto this idea of like, if you like can't rewrite the ending, then I don't know, you can still find some sort of like acceptance and peace like through your own survival. That's basically how it excels.
The kind of shift from like maybe exploring slasher and tropes to the grief story, I think it actually, as the kind of Screen Anarchy review from Sebastian Zavala-Khan says, it stops itself from depicting any kind of gratuitous violence. This critic says, would The Final Girls be a better movie if it included all the blood, gore, and breasts many of the movies it's parodying are so famous for? It certainly would have been a more accurate satire, but it would have lost its particularly innocent and goofy tone, making it a more serious and, well, deadly endeavor. This is a fun picture that's trying to both pay homage and satirize the 80s slashers without making fun or being mean to them. Strauss-Schulson and the company are fans of these films and thus aren't trying to criticize them. Pointing out and recreating horror movie tropes with their tongues firmly planted on their cheeks is what they seem to want, and since they're doing it in such a charming and creative way, it's also more than enough. But yeah, it's like basically they're highlighting that there isn't a lot of like blood and gore here. So I guess it's kind of like we don't have to fall into that trap of like it being exploitative in that way, in the way that we talked about in our Scream episode. The later Scream franchises do become quite gratuitous with the violence and what they're showing. So I guess in that way I do like they, in avoiding tackling the tropes and slashers too much, they managed to do quite a restrained depiction of stuff.
Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, produced and hosted by Zeba Aurora, Tyia Burnett, Mila F., and Louisa Johnson. Big thanks also go to Sebastian Pizarro for our wonderful theme music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at the MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on TikTok at the Monstrous Feminine Pod for podcast clips and more fun. All information can be found on our website, www.themonstrousfemininepodcast.com. We hope you enjoy this episode. Brooms up, witches out.